trustees of WTC, deans and colleagues, students and friends of New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Like a man indeed, the image of the 3-year-old Syrian boy is forever embedded. Our faces will be down for quite some time. The image of that 1-year-old infant, lifeless in the arms of a German rescuer, requires of us, as you know, what must I do? Here's my response of what I must do, responding more narrowly to your first point, but what about the points before your first point? I respond biblically, as a canonically and socially conscious biblical scholar, with roots in biblical scholarship, historically, sociologically, and theologically. In other words, what about before 70 AD? Historically, the Hebrew Bible Old Testament may be reframed as a myth of historical construction of reality framed in forced and return migration. The primeval history of the book of Genesis 1 to 11, indeed Genesis 1 begins in Babylon, when on high the gods created the heavens and the earth. The chapter indeed echoes Babylonian creation epic, textually dated no earlier than the 6th century BCE. Whereas the god of the Babylonians Marduk indeed defeat and destroy evil and chaos, Tiamat, the god of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, is not affected by Tohu or Bohu. In spite of such persistence of evil, God says, "Let there be light." This is where God is, according to the priestly tradition. Genesis 11 ends where Genesis 1 began, in Babylon.
So Genesis 11 ends where Genesis 1 began, entwining the narratives on language and building a city in Babel, Babylon. The framework of Genesis 1 to 11 is clearly set in Babylon from the perspective of Judeo-Babylonians or Judeo-Persians. As a way of reinforcing this migration point, Genesis 3, the expulsion from Eden, is now read as a narrative of forced migration, the expulsion of the southern kingdom of Judah, respectively in 3 forced migrations in 597, 587, and 582. Adam and Eve were forced to leave home. We now have seminal sociological terms to better understand these forced migrations: derivative forced migration, purposive forced migration, and responsive forced migrations. More of these terms will be noted below. Returning to the biblical narrative, the first generation experience of exile isn't exclusive. In the ensuing narrative, Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel, the second generation narrative, may also be read in the same light. Cain is marked, then forced to migrate. Noah's flood narrative may further be read as an entire upper echelon of royal and skilled workers, putting the painful experience in conflagration of Jerusalem being colonized, burned, and destroyed, 587 event, set ironically on the waters. Zedekiah's brought to Babylon only to be executed. In short, the first 11 chapters of Genesis may be reframed as narratives and experiences of forced migration to the southern kingdoms of Judah. Genesis 12 to 50 sets a new set of texts. These complex literary narratives are stories thematically about return migration.
Genesis chapters 12 and 50 begins a new set of texts. These complex literary narratives and stories of thematic return migration. It comes as little surprise and no surprise to scholars that work on generational consciousness isn't surprised by the 4-generational text. Abraham is the first generation returned migrant from Ur of the Chaldeans. As the story begins in Ur of Babylon, because that is where essentially one of the communities reside, the fact that for close to 70 years, canonical consciousness of the community at large shifted from Jerusalem to Babylon, and possibly elsewhere like Egypt, the coastlands, and even the wilderness. As the empire shifted from the Neo-Babylonians to the Persians with the Edict of Cyrus, an opportunity for the underclasses of Judeans brought to Babylon in 587 and 582, i.e. those that never made it in Babylon now had a chance to return. Whereas those that made it in Babylon or Persia, those such as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they rejected the notion of return. This is where 2nd Isaiah's brilliant return migration enters, truly suffering on behalf of the underclass. Indeed, there was a large contingent of demographics that continued to live there by the irrigation canals of Babylon for 3 or 4 generations. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they each mark a generational voice to answer their own experiences in migration. It's interesting that Joseph is never truly included as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is what sociologists like Leon Van Sickle call, in the oral tradition, storytelling comes down and ends usually with the third generation. Because by the fourth generation, there is true integration into that society. So indeed, we're all familiar when we hear the words, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but do we hardly ever say the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph? In other words, Genesis 12 to 50 is clearly a return migrations narrative, set in 3 or 4 generations. Recall the injunctive words in the Decalogue, down to the 3rd or 4th generation, a perspective of the remnant that remained in the land over against those that were forced to migrate. Sociologically, current issues and theories on forced and return migration help not only sociologists but biblical scholars to better understand the reasons and factors for migration. In my earliest work, I used empirical studies on forced migration and migrations and economics to suggest a social reconstruction of an ancient community of communities. Derivative forced migration or static migration occurred when or after a war, when new boundaries are drawn. For example, after World War I, 13 new states were created between Finland and Greece, with new minorities resulting from this remapping. In other words, you become a minority because of boundary categorizations. After Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah, or rather Jehoiakim relinquished his throne to save lives in 597, terminating the Davidic covenant, Judah became part of Babylon on the fringes of the empire, bordering Egypt. Purpose of forced migration describes people also in a non-voluntary movement. That is, these people are often victims of hostile agency of forces, such as profit, culture, race, religion, security of a dominating nation, and revenge. Lastly, responsive forced migration is a voluntary movement in response to totalitarianism, tyranny, warfare, or natural disaster. Here, the 582 group, which included Jeremiah, led to Egypt crossing an international boundary, are referenced. These in turn are correspondent to typologies of displacement such as development-induced displacement and resettlement, internally displaced persons, and refugees. As a way of example, in the Hebrew Bible and in the ancient Near East, the hydraulic hypothesis suggests that whoever controls the water sources and irrigation canals control and maintain the empire. In contemporary sociological studies, the World Bank sponsors the most incredible projects that displace hundreds of thousands of people. The Aswan Dam project in Egypt has displaced 100,000 people. Narmada Dam in Gujarat, 70,000 people. The Yakasera Reservoir project between Argentina and Paraguay, 45,000 people. The Sobrandino Dam in Brazil, 60,000 people. And the biggest of all, the Nanjingkou Dam in China, 383,000 people. The World Bank notes that at least 2 generations be factored in, and compensation, land. And the time for fruition of all of this project, 10 years. Busoni Oda's observation that the Assyrians displaced and resettled as many as 200,000 people may not be far too off from our factual numbers. But for the Judeans in 597, 587, 582, the numbers are 10,000, 7,000, and 1,000. And in Jeremiah 52, the number figures are much smaller, 3,023, 832, and 745. Lastly, theologically, migrants take difficult and impossible situations and reframe and discover faith and hope. But once again, each generation responds uniquely to its own experience of migration. In my research, I've discovered that the first generation migrant or immigrant, there's always lament. For the 1.5 generation, it's always framed in prayer and in hope. For the second generation that is born in that new context, seeking assimilation, fusing the old and new, it becomes a new creation. For the third generation, like Jacob, who returns home from Iran, it is inevitable. home. In other words, the third generation disseminates and locates where home is for others, here or there, or possibly both. And lastly, like Joseph, the fourth generation, it dreams of getting to the top. In closing, it was an ancient Israelite community when forced to migrate that gave birth to Judaism. At the center of that birth was the authority of the Davidic king, radically shifting to the authority of the text in 597 BCE, the birth of canonical consciousness. 10 years later, worship, which was sacrifice-centered, with its destruction of the temple in 587, radically shifted to prayer. Fast forward 33 years AD, another Davidic king goes into exile, the birth of the canonical consciousness with the New Testament. The destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the birth of a new religion, Christianity. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be here. This is great. Thank you for this opportunity to respond. We did have a conference call and we planned out different perspectives to take on Professor Van's paper. So I was asked to bring a more demographic, sociological, and missional perspective to this. So let me just start with a question of you all. How many of you were born and raised in this Washington, D.C. area? Pretty small number. Good. And how many of you are immigrants to the U.S.? So a pretty substantial number. So we see the impact here. Probably a third, perhaps, of the room is immigrants. 95% of the room not having been born and raised in this community. So we know we are a mobile country, a mobile global world, a global village these days. And we want to think about how this impacts the church in terms of mission. You've made a couple of references to the American church and the important role of the changing demographics of the church. I just want to say a few more words about that. When we think about our looking at this from a U.S. historical perspective, the church migrants that first created, the migrants that brought the church with them were Northern and Western Europeans by and large, who brought their Protestant and Catholic religions with them. It's true that the churches from Western Europe sent some missionaries here, but they largely did not have a large role in creating the church. It was the migrants themselves that brought the church with them. So this was a different understanding of mission, a new way, or actually reclaiming of an old way of understanding mission. I think in our Western way of thinking, we got hung up in missionaries and the language of missionaries for a long time with the church. And I want to make an argument that we have to reclaim this understanding of the people of God being on a mission of God. So our missional theology is the people of God sent by God to be the church, and the church, as you say, is a migrant church, Demographically speaking, this is a new era, the era of global transportation, global relocation. I just wanted to give you a few numbers. If you take all of the people in the world who are migrants and put them in one place, they would themselves be the fifth largest country in the world, roughly 250 million people themselves who are migrants, roughly about 3.5% of the world's population. About half of these are Christians, roughly about a quarter of them are Muslims, and the rest are spread out among other affiliations and no religious affiliation. Demographers are projecting that by the year 2050, that there will be substantial shift in that Christian migrants will be less than a third of the immigrants around the world, and Muslims will be roughly a third as well at that point, and the other third mix of others and also those without. And we'll just note that for those Christians who are the migrants in today's world, that they bring with them probably, fair to say, a more fervent Christianity than we would find here in our own country. So the migrants from Central and South America coming to the U.S., from Africa, from South Asia, Christians coming to the U.S., bringing their Christian religion with them, are infusing new vitality in a different form of Christian vitality than what the established Western European Christianity has become after the third and fourth and so on, many generations beyond that. And these are migrants who are often displaced persons, migrants who are moving for economic opportunity. When we look at refugees, we're looking at a much smaller slice of who these migrants are. I just want to make a special note, since both Peter and John made reference to the forced displaced people. The war in Syria itself has been a huge impact, creating 12.5 million refugees just in the last 5 years. Colombia, the other war-torn country, has been the second largest sender of refugees, displaced persons, at 7 million people over the last decade. So this shift, let me just give you one more statistic. I know these kind of statistics are a little overwhelming, but I'll draw some lessons from them in just a moment. A total of about close to 40,000 Muslim refugees entered the U.S., so they're now the largest group coming in of refugees, making up nearly half, 46% of the 85,000 refugees that were brought in, that were allowed into the U.S. last year. So nearly half now being Muslim. That number, though, is still a fairly small number, about 40,000, compared to the much larger number of all migrants coming into the U.S. So I want to just draw out a couple lessons of what do we make of this changing pattern, the changing pattern of who the migrants are that are coming into the U.S., the changing pattern of how they impact the church. We have a large body of scholarship that looks at the kinds of questions like, how is it that the immigrants impact the church as they enter it in terms of more or less traditional practices, perhaps, replacing clergy? To what extent are the immigrants becoming the new clergy leadership? How are they being recruited from among the immigrant groups? Another set of questions that we ask are how well are the new immigrants, how much does the immigrants' religious practices and faith impact their ability to assimilate into the culture? Interesting that it's often seen as a positive, as an asset for the immigrants who are religious to help their assimilation for practical reasons, such as getting aid and support from religious organizations, for giving them a community of fellow believers that help them to integrate. And then finally, the question of how is the immigrants' faith impacted? And again, a little bit surprisingly, that their faith becomes stronger. And there are a number of hypotheses to account for why it is that the immigrants' faith becomes stronger. And one of the kind of ironic ones is that often people who are fairly nominal in their faith, Muslims in particular, immigrating to the U.S. perceive the U.S. to be a fairly religious country, and so they feel the pressure to reclaim their religious identity as they're coming into the U.S. So some interesting twists going on, which leads to a number of lessons that I wanted us to just think about for what it means for the church to be a missional church, a pilgrim church, the people of God on the move church. What does this mean? So I think our Western tradition got distorted by a couple centuries of missions, of sending people from the West to the rest. You know, the way of thinking of Western European church, the North American church, sending out missionaries to the other parts of the world. That way of thinking is really well well past us, even though I think some of our practices still reflect that. But we need to think of our missionary model as people being on the move from everywhere to everywhere. Very consistent with the notion of the Holy Spirit, the wind that blows in all directions, moving people to and fro, push and pull factors in place in all directions, from all places to all places. What that means, though, is that one of the things that means is that there's no monopoly on understandings of our faith, on traditions, on churches, on creeds from the established West to impose or set upon others what those beliefs are. So we've only fairly recently become open to and available to hear the theologies of the people of the developing world. So literally less than a half century of liberation theologies and theologies from the underside, and we will be able to hear and to learn from how God is at work in those other communities. Closer to home, that reminds us that the mission field is everywhere. The mission field, we now talk about the mission field being in our own backyards, in our own neighborhoods, that the people with whom we live in communities represent a whole range of faiths and a whole range of non-faith traditions. And so we're engaged in mission even in our own community. So that frees us from the old colonial baggage, but it means that we have to enter into the mission field with more of our awareness, more of our presence, more of our being attuned to what the nature of the mission field is. So when missionaries were being sent from the West to a particular place, you can prepare missionaries with language and cultural skills so that they could do well in the new place where they were encountering the people with whom they wished to spread the gospel. Now as we think about mission in our own backyard, it means we need constant awareness of subcultural diversity, differences, and preparation of the people of God, the people of the church, to engage in the mission field that is all around us. So the boundaries aren't very clear, the subcultures are overlaid upon one another. It requires a new set of listening skills and a new set of speaking skills, again, requiring and depending on the Holy Spirit to help us with the translation of beliefs and practices across the mission field. We again have the image of taking the gospel to a people who are fixed in place in an earlier missionary perspective. Now we need to be conscious of the fact that people are people of no place in particular, that people are transient, as you all are transient. The mission field is one of constant and ongoing mobility, and so we have to be aware of the transient nature of opportunities in which we can even speak the gospel with and to one another. I'll state with one more point, which is really one of the points where you ended, Professor Fan, about thinking of the ethics of this, the need for our missional communities, our entire faith community to be a missional community. Again, in contrast with the old way of thinking of missionary, of having only professionally trained people who were the missionaries that were skilled and gifted to be sent out. Now everybody needs to be sent out to be prepared and equipped. And for those of us teaching in seminaries to think of how are we equipping our leaders of the church to help equip their congregations and their communities to go out into the community. So I'll just leave those handful of lessons learned about mission and pass this on. Thanks.
Good evening. You all are getting a fairly eclectic group of responses, and I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction. But first, I wanted to thank Dr. Fan for your presentation. And immediately upon your conclusion, the thought occurred to me that we are a church of immigrants and we are a country of immigrants, and we have forgotten both for the moment. And so in terms of reclaiming memory, not only as a church, but as a country of really who and what we are. I wanted to give you you all a little bit more of my background, and so sort of provide that as framing, and then also talk about the two different hats I wear tonight, and I'm going to sort of be talking to you from under those two hats. As was mentioned, I am the executive director of the Capital Area Immigrants' Rights Coalition, and we actually are active in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. We're a regional organization, and our mission is quite simply to keep immigrant families together by providing equal access to justice to immigrants threatened with detention and deportation. There are 5 detention centers in DC and Maryland that on any given day hold approximately 1,000 detained immigrants. There are no detention centers in DC. Anybody detained in DC goes to Virginia, most likely to Farmville, Virginia, which is about a 3.5-hour ride from here. Who are those folks in detention? Anyone from arriving asylum seekers to long-term permanent residents of the United States, many with deep, deep roots in the country. We also work with unaccompanied immigrant children. In the last year, approximately 60,000 children arrived in the United States, fleeing gang violence in Central America, unaccompanied by a parent or caregiver. There are 5 facilities we work with in the area. These children are also detained, with the goal of hopefully reunifying them with family in the area. That doesn't always happen. With both the adults and the children, we go in, we do individual consultations, we try to find free attorneys for these individuals. And just to give you some sense of the numbers, in 2016 we provided some sort of legal assistance to over 4,000 immigrants in detention. It really is hidden from the community, although it's getting less hidden under current policies. So we do some other things as well, but that's the bulk of our work. I also, as has been mentioned, am an elder here at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. New York Avenue Presbyterian Church is a member of the DMV Sanctuary Network of Congregations, which is the first hat that I'm going to talk to you all about. And it is essentially an act of radical hospitality. And so it is an ancient tradition rooted in the sanctuary cities of the Old Testament. You killed somebody and it was an accident, you could flee and seek protection. There have been sort of 2 waves of the sanctuary movement here that I want to talk to you a little bit about. And so I'm not a trained theologian, but my role here is to kind of take you from your head through your heart to your feet, and think about ways where we can put our faith into action. And so the sanctuary movement has been one way that the church has chosen to put their faith into action over the years. Some of you may be familiar with the first sanctuary movement in the 1980s, when people were fleeing wars in Central America, predominantly in El Salvador and Guatemala. Again, the U.S. was not recognizing these individuals as refugees. Whether or not you won an asylum case was more dependent on where you had fled than the facts of your case. And out of an experience of people being deported back to Central America, being killed, the horrific stories that were coming out about death squads, churches began to take notice, and the sanctuary movement was born at Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. I take pride in the fact that the Presbyterians have been very much behind this, as have others as well. But the Reverend John Fife took a family into the church, and so this was something not done through a formal refugee resettlement program. This was standing up to the United States government and saying, "You're wrong. My Christian faith is compelling me to do something, to put into effect what it means to love a neighbor who is about to be deported back to certain death." And so out of that first act of radical hospitality, of standing with neighbor, 300 congregations eventually across the country took individuals into their homes. The first sanctuary movement functioned very much as the way the Underground Railroad had, when people were moved up from the border into communities throughout the United States. One particular and important aspect of the sanctuary movement was the telling of stories, and I think at the end of the day, this is what was so threatening to the United States government and led to the prosecution of 5 sanctuary workers in Tucson, because people were telling a different narrative, they were telling a different story. These were doctors and lawyers and teachers and nurses who were not communists, who were not evil people. They were just like you and me, and they were sitting in living rooms and they were telling their stories, and all of a sudden people were thinking, maybe the US government isn't quite telling me the right story. There was a lot of advocacy that went around the first sanctuary movement, and long story short, law shifted and changed. The American Baptist Church actually sued the US government. There was a settlement. People got another opportunity at asylum. Just to give you some sense of the inequality, if you had fled from Nicaragua, which was then under the Sandinistas, your chance of getting asylum was about 80 to 90%. If you were fleeing from El Salvador, Guatemala, you had about a 2 to 3% acceptance rate. And so no matter how strong your case was, it was not being decided on the merit, it was being decided on politics, because we were sending $1 billion a year plus down to governments in El Salvador and Guatemala. It's a little inconvenient to be saying there's a problem there. But the law did eventually shift. And there was another opportunity to asylum, but also something called the Nicaragua Adjustment Central American Relief Act, which provided a pathway to first a green card and then to a citizenship for many of the folks who had been in sanctuary, plus many more. Obviously, there were many people who never were within the walls of a church, but because churches and other houses of worship had opened up their doors, had provided this protection, it amplified the message that it was wrong what the US government was doing, these people were deserving of protection, and church folks were putting themselves on the line and subjecting themselves possibly to arrest themselves for having done this. But the policy changed, people were able to legalize their status, thousands and thousands of people are now US citizens who came during the 1980s. And so the sanctuary movement ended because there was no longer that need to be standing in that type of solidarity and offering that type of radical hospitality. Several decades passed, and while the wars in Central America ended, a different type of violence was beginning to emerge, and that was gang-based violence. And as some of you may know, that gang violence is a direct export of the United States, and it really is one of the unintended consequences of that policy of the 1980s. Interestingly enough, Nicaragua doesn't have a gang problem. They may have other challenges, but they don't have a gang problem. And some of the people who looked at that have suggested the reason why is that families were able to immigrate intact. One of the issues that is certainly part of forced migration is the ripping apart of families. The typical migration pattern from Central America has been parents first one, then another come up, leaving children with caregivers, and then eventually they come up. But by then there's a lot of stress and tension on the families, and so because Central Americans could not legally bring their families up, and by the time they legally could immigrate family members, maybe 10, 15 years had passed, children coming up, not knowing their parents, gangs providing some alternative structural community. And so gang members then were deported back to Central America, which was the perfect petri dish in which to grow gangs. Lack of a civil society, young population awash in weapons. So the predictable happened, gangs grew and grew and grew. To the point today, if you are a young person in El Salvador, or Honduras or Guatemala, you're young and you're in a poor neighborhood, you have one of 3 options. You can join the gang, and they start recruiting in schools, 11 or 12. You can get killed because you refuse to join the gang, or you can leave. literally, those are your choices. And so when we talk about push factors, those now are the push factors out of Central America. Combined with a growing population of Central Americans who had fled after that initial wave, some fleeing gang violence, some seeking more economic opportunities, there began to grow an undocumented population. Detention and deportation started to ratchet up under the Obama administration. Obama did a lot of very good things. He was not very good on immigration, and Obama actually deported over 2 million people, more than his predecessors. The average daily population of detainees went from something like 15 to 20,000 to right now it's 39,000 people on any given night nationwide are detained in detention centers. And so churches began to take notice of this. And in 2015, Southside Presbytery, 2014, again, provided leadership, and they took a woman into sanctuary, and the demographic was a little bit different, because now it was people who had been here a long time. We're not talking about recent arrivals, and this was a woman who had 3 U.S. citizen children. She'd been here for 10 years plus, but because of no comprehensive immigration reform on the one hand, sort of dealing with this issue and increased detention and deportation, she was left with few options. And so Southside and a number of other churches stood up and said, hey, this isn't right. Tearing apart this family isn't right. And so perhaps it's time once again to think about radical acts of hospitality. And so this woman was in sanctuary for about a year. There was enough pressure brought on the government at that time, and they said, okay, fine. We'll give her what's called deferred action. She can leave, she can be here. It's not a priority. And so the sanctuary, sort of that second iteration of the sanctuary movement, remained fairly small until, not unsurprisingly, the day after the election in November. And so at that point, the faith community began to think a little bit more deeply about the need to expand sanctuary, because the president had made very clear what his plans were, and those plans have come to fruition. There have been almost 50% increase in the number of people detained since the election. And so out of that grew another sanctuary movement that was a little bit more expansive in what its ideas of sanctuary were. The initial sanctuary had been focused on taking people in the 4 walls of your church, or other houses of worship. There were synagogues that also were opening up their doors. But this idea of sanctuary was a little bit more expansive. And the idea of sort of the second sanctuary movement, and has emerged both here and nationwide, is this idea of creating safe spaces not only within the church walls, but outside the church, and how to do that as a faith community. And so the DMV Sanctuary Congregation basically was officially formed in January, February of this year. New York Avenue joined. There are now 60 plus congregations in the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, Muslim, Jewish, Christian. Reaching out to our Muslim brothers and sisters has been an important component of this, because of course it's not just immigrants that have felt unsafe. It is people of other faiths as well. And so to join the DMV Sanctuary Congregational Network, congregations were asked to commit to do one of 4 things. One, to host, which was sort of that traditional taking somebody in who has a final order of deportation. But there are also other opportunities at pumping someone to their ICE check-in. Someone who may have been going in for years, but now all of a sudden they're at risk of being detained. Promote know your rights information in communities. How can we, have people know their rights so that when ICE comes knocking, they know what to do. Engage in rapid response in the case of ICE raids. And so these 4 options really were meant to expand the notion of sanctuary as creating safe spaces in the community. And really for our neighbors, yes, these people are also immigrants, but many of them have now been here for 10, 15, 20 years. They're integrated members of our community, and what's being ripped apart is not just families, but entire communities as well. I would also say that a difference in the second sanctuary movement is more mutuality with the communities that we're engaged in. You know, there was some criticism of the white savior complex the first time around, right? You know, we're here to save you. It's been very intentional, I think, this second time around in reaching out to, in being very inclusive of the leadership of the directly impacted people themselves and asking what they want. And sometimes it isn't to come into the walls of the church. Sometimes it's to be there when ICE is knocking at their door or accompanying them to an ICE check. And so really trying to listen to what our brothers and sisters are saying. And just to finish up, that sort of takes me back to my first ad as a care coalition. We have opportunities to engage with folks who are directly impacted, shall we say. We run a detention hotline. That's a volunteer staffed hotline where people call from the detention center, either to talk to one of our attorneys or if they otherwise have an attorney to get connected up with them. We use volunteers for jail visits. It may be called civil detention, but it's not a whole lot different from criminal detention. And so seeing that, and so it's an opportunity really to walk with people, to talk with someone who, you know, ICE was knocking at their door at 5 o'clock in the morning and their wife is on the brink of losing her job because, you know, she's so stressed and worried the kids are not doing well in school. So I think as a first step to sort of deciding what is ways in which we can be supportive is listening to people who are being impacted, is to listening to immigrant families, is to reaching out to local service providers. If you are in churches that are predominantly white congregations like we are here at Newark Avenue, we need to be a little bit more intentional, but there are a lot of immigrant groups here with very strong immigrant leadership and working and connecting with them and really listening to them. And so I guess my final word of encouragement is, I think at the end of the day, I'm guided by Matthew 25, and it's what you did, it's not what you said. And so I think as a church community, we really need to think deeply about, in these particularly challenging times, how can we engage in radical acts of hospitality. Sanctuary is one example of that. I think there are others as well, but I think it is really about walking with people who are frightened, who are in pain, and maybe not being able to help them directly. I think sometimes if we can't help somebody, then we want to turn away because it's so discouraging. But I think at the end of the day, Jesus was there walking with people in their pain. And that's what we need to be doing as a church community and figuring this out together. But the closer we are, the less likely we can really look away and decide it's somebody else's issue to do.